what happened was I've retired from the printing industry about 2 years ago, and driving to work early in the morning, I'd notice taxis curb crawling looking for visible numbers, and thought there's a real gap in the marketplace here, because whilst a lot of numbers are very stylish, they don't fill the category of being highly visible. So we put our heads together and we came up with this visible plaque, which is suitable for any letterbox, and we are getting interest from the rural community too.
Yeah, amazing. They look great, big green digital numbers. Because this is a personal bugbear of mine. I hate going on a dark street and not seeing numbers.
Yeah.
You know, I hate it.
Yep.
It's true.
And you even had a message from a paramedic who said, I wish local councils would support clear numbering in all homes.
That's quite right. We've actually had feedback via Facebook from a lot of emergency services personnel. One in particular told me recently that he was responding to a code blue, a serious medical event, and when they got there were about 5 houses and they couldn't identify the numbers, and they were running around knocking on doors. And this is the sort of situation that's all too common for them, apparently.
Good on you. It's a wonderful idea. How's business?
It's picking up. Where, as with any business, it's raising your profile. That is the big battle. We've sold in the region of a couple of hundred of them so far, and we're getting very positive feedback.
Nice to have you on, Warren, and keep up the good work, and all the best with your small business there. And by the way, that number is addressid.co.nz. We do this thing every week, May, about sort of supporting just these small New Zealand made and owned.
Yeah.
And what I've discovered over the last 7 or 8 weeks is the wonderful ideas that people come up with like this.
Yes, but of course it's pioneering, isn't it? It's seeing what other people haven't seen. And what a great idea. And can I say that's not just for domestic, it's also for our CBD. Quite often I'm trying to find buildings and just cannot find the number. You have to go inside and say, hello, are you 256? You know, I think your invention is wonderful, and if I was a regulator, I would regulate it.
And in hindsight, it's so bloody obvious, isn't it? You know, it's just a simple idea, but once he says it, blindingly obvious.
Sounds like
Great idea.
sliced bread.
Yeah, exactly.
Once we didn't used to do that.
Yep.
It's hard to come up with that simple idea, though, isn't it, Alan, as a business? You know,
like my food bag. Who'd have thought that you could have a successful business just by throwing a whole bunch of things in a box and giving somebody a recipe?
When they first came out, May, I thought, that's obviously going to be a failure.
Yep, same with me, because I got my box. They asked me to test it, and I got my box, and I picked all the things I like to eat out of it. And then when my husband came to cooking meals, he said, where's the salmon? And I said, I ate that on Sunday night.
Right.
He said, you can't do that. You have to stick to the recipes. I said, who says I have to do that?
Very, very good indeed. Seriously, what if I'm a teacher? The less restricted kids are with senseless rules, the more responsible they become. The happier the classroom, the greater the learning. And I have taught the hardest, most deprived kids imaginable.
Excellent.
Wow.
Says Claire. So that's a lovely text. That's a text of the day. Thank you, Claire, for that. And Alan Blackman, May Chen, you've been a wonderful panel. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
You being on the program. I'm Wallace Chapman, back tomorrow, 3:45. Checkpoint next. See you later.
Kei te whakaronga mai koe ki te reo irarangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Nita Blake-Person in for Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, we have the latest from Melbourne on their ramped-up lockdown, with other Australian states now taking further action. Foreign yachties fear a decision between the devil and the deep blue sea if the government forces them to leave. Auckland Airport readies for a Cook Islands bubble, but is it wishful thinking? Droughts, storms, extreme rainfall and wildfires. A new report paints a grim picture of New Zealand's vulnerability to climate change. Victims question the independence of a new body to investigate bullying at Fire and Emergency. An Auckland Gymnastics club looks into claims of abusive coaching. And 2 NASA astronauts return to Earth with a splash. You can watch us live on Facebook or Freeview Channel 50.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata with DNA. The country's aviation sector is preparing for the opening of a travel bubble with other COVID-free countries by splitting major airports into 2 separate zones. Auckland Airport is dividing its international terminal into a safe travel area for bubble countries and a contained area for those going into isolation. The Aviation Council, which represents large airports and airlines, says plans are underway for doing the same at the airports in Wellington, Christchurch and Queenstown. Its co-chair, Justin Tyumbers, says it's not necessarily foreshadowing any government announcement.
This is an important part of setting up New Zealand's aviation system to be ready for any safe travel zones that do get announced by government. So this is about the sector doing the groundwork, getting things in place.
Justin Tyumbers says the airports hope to have the zones ready for operation this month. And the Prime Minister is also damping down expectations of an imminent travel bubble with coronavirus-free countries. Jacinda Ardern says it is a step in the right direction, but it is only one step.
We have to have in place a legal arrangement, protocols for pre-checks for arrival and departure, health declarations and whether they're taken from health or airlines, and whether or not you'd have things like testing or temperature checks as extra layers. We have to move through this very, very carefully.
Jacinda Ardern says the crisis in Victoria will also slow down progress toward any trans-Tasman bubble. The Climate Change Minister says for too long the problem has been dealt with by an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. The government today released a first-of-its-kind national risk assessment of climate change, which identifies 10 significant areas that urgently need addressing by the government in the next 6 years. James Shaw says if data had been available years ago, the country would be much further ahead in its flood defences.
Civil defence is kind of the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and it's always more expensive to deal with that when you're dealing with communities that are, neck deep in water, or, if you've seen, for example, the fires in the Port Hills or around Nelson over the last few years.
The Climate Change Minister, James Shaw. The National Party is promising to connect Ōtaki to Wellington's electric commuter train network and fast-track a 4-lane expressway from Ōtaki to Levin if elected. The leader, Judith Collins, has announced National would invest $330 million in new transport projects for Horowhenua and the Kapiti Coast. The projects include electrifying and double-tracking the rail line between Wellington and Ōtaki, building a full expressway interchange to Pekapeka, and completing the Horowhenua Expressway. Ms Collins says these projects will generate hundreds of jobs and reduce congestion. Following Melbourne's first night under curfew, the state of Victoria is expected to shortly announce another 429 new cases of coronavirus. Businesses are also bracing for an announcement from Premier Daniel Andrews on changes to business operations. Commerce groups fear the tightening of restrictions will spell the end for struggling businesses. Meanwhile, several restrictions have been reimposed in neighbouring South Australia, including limits on gatherings. A victims' rights advocate says anybody which handles allegations of bullying or sexual assault needs to be independent from the organisation. The Chief Executive of Fire and Emergency says such an authority is currently being established, which will operate along the lines of the Independent Police Conduct Authority. However, Rhys Jones says in their case it will be contracted by Fire and Emergency and it won't be chaired by a judge. Victim rights advocate Louise Nicholas says for any complaints authority to be successful, it needs to be truly independent.
They cannot be a part of the organisation. It has to be people not within the organisation, but who have the ability to do a mediation, to be able to bring both parties together. So it's not just contracting to whoever.
Victim rights advocate Louise Nicholas. A defence lawyer acting for a former Auckland school teacher accused of abusing 6 teenage boys says his client is innocent. Benjamin Swan, who's 56, is on trial in the High Court at Auckland, facing 10 charges of doing an indecent act on a young person involving 6 teenage boys. Today, his defence lawyer Sam Wimsett told the jury it is every person's worst nightmare to be accused of such crimes and his client is innocent of them. It's 4.5 minutes past 5. The Gymnastics New Zealand boss says he's surprised to hear Olympic hopefuls were penalised by the national body after raising concerns about an allegedly abusive coach. coach. RNZ understands athletes who spoke after a 2018 training camp were prevented from competing for several months. No action was taken against the coach, and a lawyer was called on to mediate between the athletes and Gymnastics New Zealand to reduce the sanctions on the athletes. Tony Compier insists he knows nothing of any such sanctions.
That would be a surprise to me. I'm not aware of any ramifications or exactly what they mean by ramifications, but I had no complaints raised with me in relation to that.
And Tony Compier says the body says it needs to double its efforts on educating coaches after the abuse allegations. Israel Folau's decision not to kneel down with his teammates before the English Super League match between the Catalan Dragons and St Helens is being called a personal choice. The Crosscode International remained standing as other players and match officials took a knee in support of the Black Lives Matter campaign. Dragons coach Steve McNamara says some players and staff didn't take a knee and the club respect their personal choice on the matter. Folau, a fundamentalist Christian, joined the Dragons after being sacked by Rugby Australia last year for a social media post they considered homophobic. And the former All Blacks coach Steve Hansen is officially a Sir. The two-time World Cup winner has received his knighthood from Governor-General Dame Patsy Reddy at a ceremony in Christchurch. That's the news.
Back to earth.
Splashdown.
As you can see on your screen, we have visual confirmation for splashdown.
Back to reality.
Before you've got to err on the side of caution and go further and go harder. Therefore, we have to do more, and we have to do more right now.
And back home.
A fisherman's version of rough versus what probably a land person would call rough are two very different things.
We're back tomorrow. Morning Report, weekdays from 6, on air and online.
Now, the short forecast from Metzuvis to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Coromandel, Gisborne and Northern Hawke's Bay. Mostly cloudy with a few showers, clearing from most places tomorrow. For the remainder of the North Island, mainly fine, apart from areas of cloud. A few showers possible about Auckland, Waikato and Western Bay of Plenty today. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury, fine with areas of high cloud. Bulla, areas of cloud in the north, but periods of rain in the south. Westland and Fiordland, cloudy periods of rain in Westland, spreading to some parts of Fiordland tomorrow. Otago and Southland, fine weather with increasing high cloud, rain developing about coastal Southland tomorrow night. And Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, a few showers tomorrow. RNZ National, it's 7.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Nita Blakeperson, in tonight for Lisa Owen. Well, tonight, Auckland International Airport announces it will be split into 2 zones in preparation for safe travel bubbles. Chief Executive Adrian Littlewood will join us live in a few minutes, but at the same time, the Prime Minister is warning whilst it's good to be prepared, a travel bubble is some way off. It comes as the situation across the Tasman worsens, and those in the state of Victoria adjust to a new life under lockdown for the next 6 weeks at least. An 8 p.m. until 5 a.m. curfew came into place last night as the number of infections grows to over 6,000, with more than 20 deaths over the weekend alone. Victoria's Premier Daniel Andrews is due to hold a press conference in the next few minutes where he's expected to announce another 429 cases. We'll bring you the latest. But as Alex Perrottet reports, doctors are calling for more transparency on how the government is planning to battle the virus as health authorities struggle to trace the source of many hundreds of infections.
Australia's brand new Medical Association President Dr Omar Khorshid says the public health response in Melbourne has been subpar. It comes after a horror weekend of more than 1,000 new infections and 20 deaths across the state, including, crucially, more than 700 mystery cases where health officials can't actually trace the source. Epidemiologists say it's not good enough. Professor John Matthews at the University of Melbourne says both medical professionals and the public don't even know what data the government is collecting when testing people.
The numbers that the Victorian government has reported are very hard to interpret because we have a sudden jump from 49 cases to hundreds of cases, and we don't know the context. We don't know the protocol the government's using, and so it's been very difficult.
Residents were given just a few hours' notice of the strict new Level 4 lockdown measures by Premier Daniel Andrews yesterday. A curfew from 8 p.m. until 5 a.m. will last 6 weeks. Melbourne City lawyer Louis Supan says he had no warning the curfew was coming.
Well, it was very dead. I mean, I live near the city, and, before 8 o'clock, people were going back home. And it's very surprising that the government, said starting tonight. Usually they'll give a couple of days' notice. But, it was a recipe for disaster because people were panic buying. People were thinking, oh, no, what's going to happen with the food, with the supplies?
He says it's hard to trust the government is taking the right steps, given the mistakes that many believe led to such a spike of cases.
We're doing everything. We're complying. We're wearing our masks. We're staying at home. We're not going over to people's houses. And then, why is it still going up? And people are just over it. It's just, we're so drained out. We've done stage 3. We're doing it again. And now we're in stage 4. Why should we suffer a bigger lockdown because the government can't get it under control?
There are signs some Victorians have still been disregarding the messaging, with new data on road use today showing traffic on some of the busiest roads was almost 20% higher in recent weeks than during the first lockdown. But it's the unknown data that's got doctors worried. Professor John Matthews said there would be more cooperation from Victorians if the government shared the information it's collecting and giving confidence about the standard of contact tracing.
Everyone knows it's much more difficult to do good contact tracing when you've got large numbers. There's the technical value of having extra information, but the psychological value of knowing that the Premier is prepared to acknowledge the difficulties that they've had with contact tracing, and people like honesty.
John Matthews wants to see information such as the rate of positive tests among those who have COVID-19 symptoms compared to those who are asymptomatic. He says the government has used the analogy that they're fighting a war, but he says there's a common enemy and no need to shield people from vital information. The situation is prompting other premiers to tighten up. Gladys Berejiklian in New South Wales says the situation is precarious and the next few weeks are make or break. But she stopped short of enforcing things like wearing masks and instead offered advice.
So you need to judge yourself, and you should do what I do. I always have a mask in my pocket. If I feel uncomfortable about a situation, I can wear it if I feel that my social distancing is being compromised. So I recommend everybody have a mask in their pocket or in their bag, and if they feel that they're in a situation they need to wear one, they should.
With such a big state and with only 13 new cases overnight, the Premier says it's a difficult balance, with those in the border communities upset at the rules imposed on them.
When you go down to the border communities, people are angry with me because I'm being too tough, and they would like to see the restrictions eased, but we are having to be tough on the borders because of the situation that faces us.
Meanwhile, South Australia is taking a much harder line, with only 2 confirmed new cases today. Premier Stephen Marshall is bringing back stage 3 restrictions, limiting private gatherings to 10 and forcing bars and restaurants to keep people seated. For Checkpoint, Alex Perrottet.
Back here, foreigners stranded in New Zealand are making concerted pleas to stay here. Yachties don't want to untie from New Zealand marinas to face the dangers of seasonal Pacific storms, and backpackers don't want to go back to COVID-ravaged countries. Some are even afraid of returning to politically unstable countries. That's according to the organiser of a petition. And they're asking the government to let them stay. Here's our reporter Tracy Neal with the story.
Retired Welsh doctor Chris Bates and his wife were stopped from sailing away from New Zealand in May because of the COVID-19 lockdown.
We're on our boat, which is our home. We were planning to sail from New Zealand in May via Australia and South Africa, and the government kindly extended our visas until September the 25th of this year.
It's left them and what he says are several hundred others between the devil and the deep blue sea.
We can't leave here in the spring because we'd be sailing into the cyclone season in the Pacific, which begins on the 1st of November. And we don't have anywhere to actually go to.
Dr. Bates is among a growing number of stranded foreigners wanting to stay longer. Backpackers are now urging the government to grant a 6-month extension for working holiday visa holders. A petition attracted almost 13,500 signatures before it closed last week. Organiser Marie Bock, who's on a working holiday from her home in Germany, says many want to stay in New Zealand for a number of reasons.
They are afraid of the situation back home. Maybe not only COVID, but in general, political situations aren't as good as in New Zealand. People are afraid of the future, and I think it's just very normal that you want to stay in a safe place as long as possible.
Among those who signed is Mindy Simmons, who said on the online petition,
"I'm signing because going back to my home country seems entirely unconscionable at the moment."
Daniel Eichlin signed 3 weeks ago and said,
"I'm waiting for Australia to open. Otherwise, I'll have to go back to the US where the virus is ravaging the country."
Jenny Walzenberg says,
"I'm signing because as long as the borders are still closed and no new people can come in, it's important to keep the backpackers who are already here and want to stay. For a lot of backpackers, New Zealand is important for them too, to give them a safe place to stay and live during this crazy pandemic."
Marie Bock says their plight is little different to stranded migrant workers for whom the government recently granted exemptions by extending work visas. She says talk of a looming labour shortage in New Zealand is another reason for the petition.
And I also saw New Zealand's perspective, just thought that the country will need workers during the spring and summer season, so I think it's more giving and taking, and not only backpackers wanting to stay longer.
Ms Bock is now hoping for a quick result before Parliament is going into pre-election recess. Green Party MP Chloe Swarbrick received the petition, which is now in the hands of the party's immigration spokesperson, Golriz Garaman. She says it's an urgent matter which deserves attention.
We know there's people here who, in good faith, come here, are working and have then been essentially stranded, or rather, even if they can go back, they'd be going back to places that might be dangerous, and now their visa processing considerations are all kind of changed in a changed world.
Ms Garaman says they'll work quickly to get the petition in front of the Minister. In a statement, a spokesperson for Immigration Minister Chris Farfoy says his office will look into whether there are plans to extend the working holiday visas further. Chris Bates and his wife Penny will in the meantime keep their yacht tied firmly to the dock in Whangarei Marina. The 70-year-olds say leaving the boat here and flying home isn't an option.
We live on the boat, so this is actually our home. If we fly home, then we have to find a home, and we don't know when we can actually return.
Dr Bates says they're grateful for what the New Zealand government has done for them so far, but want it to enact a provision that allows yachts and crew to stay in New Zealand if the risk of leaving is too great. For Checkpoint, Tracy Neal.
A former Auckland school teacher is on trial in the High Court accused of abusing 6 teenage boys. Benjamin Swan has pleaded not guilty to 10 charges of doing an indecent act on a young person. The 56-year-old is accused of sexually assaulting 6 teenagers, allegations he categorically denies. Our court reporter Annika Smith filed this story.
In his opening address this morning, Benjamin Swan's defence lawyer Sam Wimsett held up a Crown charging document detailing allegations of sexual offending against 6 minors. He told the jury it was every person's worst nightmare to be accused of such crimes, and his client was innocent of them.
It should only become Mr. Swan's reality if the Crown can prove these charges beyond reasonable doubt. And the defence says that the evidence in this case, when you actually look at it, logically or forensically, falls well short of meeting that standard.
Benjamin Swan, also known as Benji, has worked in Auckland schools for 30 years, last teaching at Otahuhu College. It's the Crown's case he touched the genitals of 6 teenage boys, allegations Mr. Swan categorically denies. The 56-year-old sounded out loud a not guilty plea to each of the 10 charges as they were read out to him this morning. Mr. Wimsett said none of the boys had been sexually assaulted and, in an unusual move, confirmed Mr. Swan would elect to give evidence in his own defence.
I'll be saying to you at the end of the case, is it possible that Mr. Swan's denials are actually true? I'll say, of course it is. Not only is it possible, it's actually the true position. But if it's possible, the Crown won't have proven its case.
Much of the detail about Mr Swan's case is suppressed to protect the identities of the complainants. Opening the Crown's case this morning, Chris Howard told the jury they would be hearing from the 6 teenage boys themselves. Mr Howard said they'd each been assaulted by Mr Swan, sometimes alone, sometimes in the presence of others, and sometimes behind locked doors. He said the stories were too similar to be made up.
It is the Crown case that similarities between all of these allegations are not a coincidence, they are not the result of collusion. The Crown case is that these allegations are similar because the defendant did similar things to all of these boys.
The court has heard Mr Swan's case as a retrial after a trial in May last year ended in a hung jury. Today, a DVD interview was played in which one of the complainants tells the interviewer Mr Swan touched his penis behind locked doors. The teenager was later pressed by Mr Wimsett about his memory of the incident, admitting he'd assumed Mr Swan locked the doors without actually seeing him do it. Mr Swan's trial is one of the first off the blocks after jury trials were suspended in March ahead of the COVID-19 lockdown. His trial before Justice Moore and a jury of 6 women and 6 men is set down for 3 weeks. Ātui te ko te mātua ko Annika Smith aho.
A fight in Porirua during which a man was stabbed and killed has been described as a pack attack, vicious and sudden. Hone Pawa died at the scene in May last year and Ngāpaki Grip is on trial for murder in the High Court at Wellington. Jonathan Mitchell was there.
On the afternoon of May the 9th last year, Ngāpaki Grip and his cousin were in Porirua in a car parked up after getting takeaways. Hone Pawa and a handful of others were in the same area and had been drinking. Mr Grip's lawyer, Mike Antanovic, told the court on day 1 of the trial today his client and cousin were targeted by the group.
This was a pack attack, the defence says. The defendant and his cousin were clearly outnumbered. Ngāpaki Grip, members of the jury, did absolutely nothing to provoke what happened.
He said Mr Pawa was taller and heavier than Mr Grip, who had no other option but to act defensively.
Ngāpaki Grip didn't have the leisure to sit and ponder what his response might be. He didn't have time on his side. These things just unfolded, as I've said, suddenly, out of the blue and viciously.
However, the Crown disputes the theory of self-defence. Crown lawyer Andrew Britton told the court Mr Grip was heard saying, "Do you want to get stabbed?" twice after pulling a knife from the car. He says Hone Pawa was struck 6 times.
The Crown says that the defendant, with the knife in his hand, says to Hone Pawa words to the effect of, "Do you want to get stabbed? Do you want to get stabbed?" In what follows, the Crown says the defendant stabs Hone Pawa 6 times.
He described where Mr Pawa was stabbed.
One of the 6 stab wounds went through the left side of his chest, his heart, his diaphragm, and into his liver. The issue in this trial is whether or not the defendant's actions were unlawful.
Andrew Britton says Hone Pawa collapsed in a nearby park and the fight was interrupted by an off-duty officer. A paramedic told the jury of 8 women and 4 men he saw a trail of blood and attempted to save Mr Pawa. He described a number of hysterical onlookers as other paramedics were called in to help. More than 40 witnesses are expected to give evidence. Many have asked not to be recorded or photographed by media in court. Mike Antanovic told the jury during his brief opening remarks to keep an open mind over the course of the trial, which could last up to 3 weeks. For Checkpoint, Court Jonathan Mitchell, aho.
The council-owned lines company Orion has been accused at the High Court in Christchurch of obstructing the investigation into the cause of the 2017 Port Hills fires. 80 claimants who suffered property damage want $10 million, alleging negligence by Orion and the Christchurch Adventure Park. Opening the group's case, Craig Stevens said the Early Valley fire was started by molten metal from a faulting power pole falling onto tinder-dry grass. He says Orion's replacing of this pole just 3 days later and its failure to retain crucial parts of it obstructed the investigation.
It destroyed the area of origin it disposed of the vital artefact of the expulsion, dropout, fuse, and Your Honour, that to lose that, it had to be unscrewed.
Mr Stevens says despite one of its own electricians believing a fault could be to blame, the company insisted on pointing the finger of suspicion at Ken McKenzie, the owner of the property where the fire started.
That Orion persist with this outrageous or hurtful slur is only, we say, to deflect the evidence which will show that it was Orion, not an arsonist, that caused the outbreak of the Early Valley Road fire.
The owners of the adventure park, a top attraction for mountain bikers, are also being blamed for helping to spread the second fire at Marley's Hill, 4 kilometres away. This started 90 minutes after the Early Valley blaze. Mr Stevens says the park continued to run its chairlift, dropping burning plastic from the chairs onto the ground. He said this led directly to the fire, which until then was contained, roaring up the hill and damaging homes on Worsley's Road.
In the space of a few hours from when the adventure park's outbreak occurred on the Wednesday afternoon, Cecile Grace had lost her recently repaired home, all of their family memorabilia, and apart from some limited clothes, the only thing they had time to grab before literally running for their lives was a photo of her late husband.
Lawyers for the two defendants are due to open their cases tomorrow. A visit to the scene of the fire will happen on Wednesday. The trial is scheduled to last 9 weeks. It is 26 minutes past 5. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen for your feedback and you can text us on 2101, tweet us at checkpointrnz or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Well, Auckland Airport has this afternoon announced it will split the international terminal into 2 separate zones in preparation for safe travel bubbles. The Prime Minister this afternoon said, with the escalating number of infections in Australia, we shouldn't count on a bubble anytime soon.
I haven't put a time frame on it, but everyone can see, based on our clear criteria right from the beginning, that we will not open a Trans-Tasman bubble until it is safe. It will be obvious to everyone that that is not right now, and it will not be for some time to come.
Well, joining me now live is Auckland Airport Chief Executive Adrian Littlewood. Kia ora, Adrian. So we've just heard the Prime Minister. Is this wishful thinking, organising the airport into 2 areas when it doesn't look like any travel bubble is imminent?
No, look, I think it's about being prepared. I think we've been obviously working with government agencies, airlines and other organisations operating at the airport, and also considering, the prospect of potentially some safe travel zones in the future, whether it to be places like Rarotonga or indeed Australia in the future. And I think we've been preparing and planning for that. That was part of the work that we did with many different organisations earlier this year to anticipate the process. And so we're really getting our part of that puzzle ready by separating our international terminal into 2 separate zones.
So how do those zones actually work? What's separating them and how do we make sure there's no mingling there?
Yeah, so what we'll be doing is we've actually put in place physical separation to segregate and isolate Pier B of our international terminal and really put a separate processing system with all the processes required for inbound and outbound activity inside that separate terminal, and then that leaves our primary Pier A, which is our gates 1 to 10, free to act as a safe travel zone for outbound travellers and for those people who might come to and from safe travel zone areas.
So food, duty-free, all of those things, how's that going to work?
Yeah, look, as a traveller, if you're going to a safe travel zone destination, you will see something that looks fairly close to normal. Obviously, there are processes and protocols we have around hygiene and cleanliness and other processes that we have in place that will persist. But it will be as close to normal for that destination, and there will be shops and other services open at that time. But we've got to remember that certainly if these things happen and the government approves the start of these things, it will be lower volume than usual, so it won't feel quite as busy and as active as travellers might have been used to in the past.
It sounds like it could bring back some business to the airport, though.
Small amount of business. We were one of the busiest airports in our region in the month of June, but it's still down 85% on where we were last year. So we're still in very unusual times, and
But we're hopeful, and as conditions are acceptable and as the officials in government give that go-ahead, we want to be ready to go, as do all our partners in the aviation system. So we're simply getting ready.
Is it the government that's asked you to bring these changes in preparation for any of those bubbles?
No, not specifically. I think it's every one of the system playing their part in getting ready, should the conditions allow, and that's really simply us doing that. Obviously, we keep the government agencies, government itself, well advised as to how we are proceeding. But I think it's important that, as we did for the return of domestic travel in level 2 and now into level 1, that we are as prepared as we can be. So if the conditions are right, we're ready to go, and that was successful in domestic, and as the time is right for safe travel zone travel, that the airport aviation systems are also ready.
Hey, Adrian, I see the International Air Transport Association isn't expecting air travel to get to the pre-COVID levels right until 2024. Is that your expectation too at this stage?
It's hard to say exactly how it'll turn out for New Zealand. It's no doubt going to be challenging for some time, and I think what's going to be difficult is every country will be at a different state of readiness depending on their health performance. Obviously New Zealand's health performance is a real standout globally, and I think that will make us an attractive place to come to, but naturally that will very much depend on each of those countries' health performance themselves. So, you could see, while a global lowering of tourism demand across the world on average, you could see pockets of increased travel within safe travel zones. So our view has always been, should Australia, for example, get to a safe condition, and certainly large parts of Australia are still safe, but obviously Victoria is having its own challenges right now, that internal market, could be a source of real travel activity. The health conditions have to be right, but I think we can see potentially with the domestic travel in New Zealand within our country has, responded well. It's not where it used to be, but people are still keen to travel around and take a break where they can and where it's safe to do so. So we could see that sort of pop up in our neck of the woods if we have a safe travel zone established with those kinds of countries.
Hey, Adrian, thank you so much for your time. That's Adrian Littlewood, the Auckland Airport CEO. Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, we have some breaking news. The Victoria Premier, Daniel Andrews, has just announced 429 new infections and 13 more deaths from COVID-19 in Victoria overnight. We'll have the latest. Victims question the independence of a new body to investigate bullying at fire and emergency. An Auckland Gymnastics club reels over allegations of overtraining and abusive coaching styles. And a new report paints a grim picture of New Zealand's vulnerability to climate change. We'd love your feedback on anything you've heard tonight, especially on the Trans-Tasman bubble. When do you think it will be safe to travel again? You can text us on 2101 and you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But first, here's Susana Leotawa with the headlines.
Turning to the Prime Minister is tempering expectations of a possible travel bubble with the Cook Islands despite preparations by Auckland Airport. Plans are underway to split the terminal into 2 zones, separating different categories of travellers to avoid contact. Jacinda Ardern says it is a step in the right direction, but it is only one step and the government has to move through them very carefully. The state of Victoria has confirmed 429 new cases of coronavirus in the past 24 hours, along with a further 13 deaths. The Premier, Daniel Anderson, is currently outlining further restrictions to businesses as Melbourne prepares for its second overnight curfew. The Climate Change Minister is trumpeting a new first-of-its-kind national risk assessment addressing 10 areas that need urgent government attention in the next 6 years. James Shaw says the country would be much further ahead in its flood defences if this data was available years ago. The National Gymnastics body says it needs to double its educational efforts following a raft of abuse allegations at an Auckland club. Numerous anonymous parents at North Harbour Gymnastics are claiming coaches abused, body-shamed and overtrained girls at the club, according to the New Zealand Herald. Gymnastics New Zealand Chief Executive Tony Compier says the organisation needs to double its efforts on educating coaches. The National Party is vowing to improve public transport and roading links between Horowhenua, the Kapiti Coast and Wellington if elected. The $330 million pledge from leader Judith Collins includes a promise to extend Wellington's electric commuter train network to Otaki and fast-track a four-lane expressway from Otaki to Levin. The man accused of murdering Constable Matthew Hunt in June will argue for name suppression in the Court of Appeal. RNZ has received confirmation the 24-year-old accused has filed an appeal that will be heard later this year. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. We are turning now to business news with Nicholas Poynton. Well, Nicholas, two major credit card companies say that they're going to reduce their payment fees today, but small businesses are meeting that announcement with a degree of caution. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so as you and I hope everyone else is probably aware, that every time you pay for something by your with a card, that the business who you're buying stuff from, they incur a fee with every swipe. And these fees are known as merchant fees. They include bank fees, as well as fees for the hire of the EFTPOS terminal. However, when you swipe with a credit card, that's another fee that's sort of lumped in and bundled together. And look, they may only be a couple of percent, but in the aggregate, if that's how you have to think about this, they can actually be quite the charge, especially for small businesses. I think of like your corner dairy. You know, if they're charging something for $4 and they're incurring quite a small fee on that, it's something that does build up over time. So MasterCard and Visa, they have agreed to reduce the interchange fees that they charge banks whenever a customer buys something. And there's been quite a positive response from this. Retail New Zealand says it could lead to savings of about 0.1 and 0.2%. And look, that may sound very minuscule, but once again, you have to think about this in the aggregate. And they expect that with these savings, that these could be passed on to the businesses. But an advocacy group for SMEs, they say, well, they're a bit cautious about this because it all depends on whether the banks actually pass on their savings to the businesses, because, look, they have a lot of power in this dynamic. And like straight out the gate, Westpac Bank have come out and said that yes, look, they're going to review its pricing structure for a lot of its customers and clients that they deal with, and they say it's going to benefit the businesses where transaction volumes are lower, and this can often result in higher costs. But with an announcement like this, it's really just wait and see. So it'll be really interesting to sort of keep an eye on this going forward to see what, businesses, especially the smaller businesses, are saying about, how that pricing structure is working. Are they actually seeing the benefit of the supposed reduction in these merchant fees?
Yeah, watch this space. And nextly, sticking with SMEs, a report has found that ongoing border closures having a unique impact on them. Why is that?
Yeah, so, well, as we're probably aware, a lot of businesses have been looking to raise money throughout the pandemic. We can think of the big, large companies that are listed on the NZX. About 24 of them have, tapped the shoulders of their shareholders or gone to institutional investors, and they've raised about $5 billion. And look, that's great for them. That's awesome. But for small, privately owned businesses, this isn't really a luxury that they can enjoy. They tend to rely on domestic and overseas businesses and private equity firms to sort of raise capital, because they don't always want to be going to their banks and raising debt. And capital at the moment is really important for businesses. A lot of businesses during the lockdown, they had to tap into the capital reserve to sort of keep things going. The wage subsidy scheme would only do so much for a number of businesses. And capital is also important because there are some strong players in the market right now who may be sort of eyeing the way things are looking at the moment, and they think, hey, this might be a good time for acquisition. And there's also those people who just own businesses who maybe think, look, now's a good time to maybe sell up, but you need someone with capital to buy your business, right? Well, a report from PwC says that the border closures are actually sort of cutting off that flow of overseas capital to our SMEs, because when a deal like this is done between, a small business here in New Zealand and maybe an overseas private equity firm or a business that wants to acquire it from overseas, there's a lot of due diligence that's done, and it's not something that can be done over the phone. Someone from that business will probably travel to New Zealand. They want to meet management. They want to get a good sense of the day-to-day operations. Well, with border closures, that's not able to happen. And what PwC is saying that, look, they've noticed a complete, the transactions they had coming through their corporate finance team coming into lockdown, that is all pretty much stalled. They've been able to do a few deals. So effectively, this one of the main avenues for businesses to access and raise capital has been cut off. And it sort of casts quite a dark shadow over what's going to happen when that wage subsidy scheme ends, because, capital is really important for businesses when it comes to growing their business, for investing, for paying staff. And this is another thing. It seems to be a cliche almost. I say every time I come on the show, it's another watch your space type situation.
Very much, yeah. Not looking great though. Can you give us a quick hop around the markets?
Yeah, sure. So the NZX Top 50 is down by 0.5% by 62 points to 11,666. The New Zealand dollar is steady at 66.3 US cents, up by 0.2% to 92.9 Australian, and down to 50.7 British pence. And keeping up with gold, the yellow metal is down ever so slightly to $1,974 US an ounce.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. That was Nicholas Poynton, our business reporter. Well, victims are worried that a new body that will investigate allegations of sexual assault and bullying at Fire and Emergency New Zealand won't be independent. Current and former firefighters say it needs to be entirely separate from an organisation that has ignored multiple serious complaints in the past. Their calls followed last year's report, which found bullying and harassment were endemic across all levels of the organisation. Harry Locke reports.
Jamie says she was sexually assaulted by a senior staffer at the brigade when she was working as a volunteer firefighter. She says she felt the moral obligation to report the assault, but when she went to police in her small town, she was told they wouldn't be doing anything. Jamie then complained directly to Fire and Emergency, or FENS, but there as well, she was met with a brick wall.
The way the chain of command works is the person I would have reported what had happened to me is the person who had assaulted me.
She broke the chain of command and went to the fire chief instead, but found no help.
The moment I made a formal complaint to him, he contacted head office, and the very first thing he requested was information on how to snow job it and make it go away. That was the very first thing, not to get me support, not to give me help, not to do the right thing, but to hide it.
Jamie says she's spoken to other current and former firefighters with similar experiences. They were assaulted, bullied or harassed at work, but the organisation did nothing when they complained. An independent review into the culture at Fire and Emergency New Zealand, published last year, found bullying and harassment is a feature of the workplace at all levels and across all regions, and there are barriers to reporting it. It made 33 recommendations, which the Chief Executive of Fire and Emergency, Rhys Jones, says are currently being implemented.
It is our opportunity to rectify this rather than blindly going on, assuming and pretending that it doesn't occur. And this has been a central pillar of my time as Chief Executive, that we are going to have to address this problem. We're going to stamp it out. It's intolerable.
But another sexual assault victim, Sarah, says what's needed most is an independent authority that sits completely outside the organisation.
Anything that is within FENS, that is funded by FENS, is never going to be able to hold to account the people with power in the organisation. The issue and a lot of the abusers are within national headquarters, and that level needs independence over it. It needs to be an independent authority.
Rhys Jones says it is setting up an independent body to handle complaints, which will be like the Independent Police Conduct Authority, with the power to make binding recommendations. But unlike that authority, this body will be contracted by Fire and Emergency, and it won't be headed by a judge. Victim rights advocate Louise Nicholas, whose allegations she was raped by police officers led to an inquiry into how investigations and complaints were handled by the police, says there is no point setting up a conduct authority that is not independent.
They cannot be a part of the organisation. It has to be people not within the organisation, but who have the ability to do a mediation, to be able to bring both parties together. So it's not just contracting to whoever.
Fire and Emergency figures show it received 2 complaints of sexual harassment this year, which it referred to the police. There were 8 complaints last year, of which 3 were upheld, 2 were referred to the police, and 2 resulted in dismissal. For Checkpoint, Harry Locke.
Well, Tracy Martin is the Minister for Internal Affairs and oversees Fire and Emergency. She says there's an historical problem of bullying and harassment, but action is being taken to fix that.
What we saw from the Coral Shore report was that Fire and Emergency has a historical problem with bullying and harassment here in New Zealand. And so that is why the Shore report was so important, and also the actions that FENS have taken since then and continue to take are really, really vital.
The actions that they're taking, though, don't seem to go far enough for the complainants. They're saying complete inaction, in fact. What are you confident is being done to change things there?
Well, I guess I can only talk from my conversations with the board. I can only talk from my conversations with the CE, my conversations with the women's leadership groups. I was at the UFBA conference last year where this was actually the major focus of that conference for our firefighters. I was at the Women in Firefighters Australian conference here in 2018 at Te Papa where this was another major focus. So I know that this has been and is a focus for Fire and Emergency New Zealand. They have been moving on some of the 33 recommendations that came out of the Shaw report. And I have confidence, the chairman of the board gives me confidence that they are moving forward with an independent complaints process.
How independent is that complaints process going to be? How's it going to work?
Well, it's out for tender at the moment, is my understanding, in the conversations that I've had with Paul Swain, the chairman of the board. And so, because I think probably one of the first things to understand is we have career firefighters, so they would be covered by employment law if there was any issue like this. And then you've got volunteers, and it's volunteers that the complaints process needs to be accessible and fair and transparent, but independent. So one of the things that the Fire and Emergency has been doing is 2 rounds of consultation with our employees, with volunteers and the public about how that scheme would work. But right now there is a tender out for that independent organisation to be able to provide that service.
A tender because that service is going to be contracted by FENZ?
Certainly. The money will be paid by FENZ to an independent organisation to deliver on that, on the surety for both mediation or taking the complaints to the level that they need to be taken to.
But in comparing this independent body with the IPCA, for example, over at police, that is completely independent. If this is being contracted by FENZ, doesn't that call into question just how independent it is?
So I guess that would only be a suggestion if one is saying that this organisation that would tender for this contract would not do the job they are paid to do because they feel that they owe FENZ some sort of loyalty? Is that what you're suggesting? That they couldn't be an independent body and actually make sure that they followed through appropriately on complaints?
Just in that, how removed are they from Fire Emergency in the first place? If that is who their contract is through, there is, somewhat of a relationship there, as opposed to the IPCA, where that's a completely independent body.
Well, the independence comes from that certainly while somebody is paying your bills, I would imagine that your reputational value, that you do the job you are paid to do appropriately and at the highest level, is what maintains the confidence of the public and as well as those using your service.
Just in terms of understanding how you've been hearing about the complaints and the media reports, how many of the stories of the women who've come forward have you heard or have you spoken to about their experiences?
Well, I understand that one of the young ladies contacted my office around a cadet program around early 2019, sent a letter to my office and I responded to her. She raised concerns about a cadet program and I responded to her around the screening and so on and so forth that FENZ has in place. Otherwise, to the best of my knowledge, I haven't had any direct contact with the complainants.
Are you confident that young woman's situation was dealt with?
I would prefer not to comment on the specific cases of these women. I don't know enough to be able to answer that with confidence because they are historical cases and part of them was managed by the police, part of them was managed by the Fire and Emergency New Zealand, and none of that was managed by my office.
I guess in terms of understanding how historical these cases are, though, the complaints are still coming forward and women say the culture still isn't changing. So if that was 18 months ago that happened, how do we know what is happening now, other than the conversations you're having with the board? These complainants are still coming forward. Are you confident things are changing?
Well, as I say, sorry, I apologise. I understood your last question to mean the 2 women that are actually in the mainstream media at the moment. If you're referring to others who have come through the complaint system, the interim complaint system that have been in place in fire and emergency over the last 3 years, then I don't recall having any direct conversation with any of the complainants. I do, however, have sat down with the women's leadership group that was put together in around about 2017, 2018 by Fire and Emergency New Zealand to make sure that the women inside the organisation were able to articulate freely the challenges that they had, that they were able to articulate that to the leadership teams of Fire and Emergency New Zealand with no backlash, and so that they were part of changing the culture, a historical culture that was inherited by Fire and Emergency New Zealand.
It is 10 minutes to 6. I'm Nita Blake-Person and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback on anything you're hearing tonight. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at checkpointrnz or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. An Auckland Gymnastics club is reeling over allegations of overtraining and abusive coaching styles. An article in this weekend's New Zealand Herald outlined accusations of abuse, body shaming and overtraining at Auckland's North Harbour club. The claims have sparked an investigation and calls for other victims to come forward. Jean Bell filed this report.
Unnamed parents claim girls as young as 8 are being fat-shamed, verbally abused and forced to train while injured at the club. North Harbour Gymnastics Chief Executive Mike Thompson says he's not aware of any direct allegations from the community and he does not know who exactly is making them. But he says the club is taking the claims seriously.
Certainly the majority of the allegations that have been included in the article I was not aware of at all, so gut-wrenching for the club.
He says an independent investigation into the allegations is taking place.
You know, if there are incidents like this that occur in the gym, we certainly need to make sure that we drill down to actually having a presence on the training floor to ensure that we're consistent.
Gymnastics New Zealand is asking gymnasts to confidentially report any abuse. Chief Executive Tony Compier says about 15 people have contacted the organisation so far. Some were complaints, others were historical reports and recommendations for changes. Mr Compier says the organisation sets out clear behavioural expectations.
There already are across our educational resources clear requirements, guidelines, expectations, codes, if you like, setting out to coaches and also those who are engaged in our community about the behavioural expectations and requirements. So they are there, but they are an ever-evolving continuum.
He says the vast majority of athletes have a good experience.
We need to double our efforts in continuing the work that we do with regards to education and informing our coaching fraternity and our club fraternity regarding what our requirements and expectations are around behaviour.
Former gymnast Belinda Moore represented New Zealand in the 1990s. She is calling for coaches to be more closely monitored with mandatory vetting. She retired at 17 and says most gymnasts hit their high as children.
In gymnastics, you're trying to squeeze a whole 30-year career into about 8 years. And most of that time you will be a child. And so really we have to put in procedures and systems that protect what are children.
Another former athlete, Dr. Georgia Servin, says abusive coaching has been an issue for the sport on a global level for at least 20 years.
They're not things that we would consider acceptable if they were happening in other contexts like schools or perhaps even other sports.
In a statement, Sports New Zealand Chief Executive Peter Miskimen urged gymnasts to report any concerns. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi nei ko Jean Bell tēnei.
For too long, climate change has been dealt with by an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. That's how Climate Change Minister James Shaw has described the situation as the government today released a first-of-its-kind national risk assessment of climate change. Here's political reporter Joe Moyer.
The risk assessment was mandated as part of the Zero Carbon Bill, with the condition that an adaptation plan would be developed within 2 years of its release, and a new assessment would be done at least every 6 years. The report identified 10 significant areas that need urgently addressing by the government before the next assessment. It comes in an environment where extreme weather events, such as storms, heat waves and heavy rainfall, are likely to be more frequent and intense. defence. At the same time, the number of frost and snow days are projected to decrease, while drought and wildfire risk will ramp up. Risk areas that need urgently addressing include coastal and indigenous ecosystems, people vulnerable to being displaced, costs associated with disaster relief and lost productivity, and increased demand and pressure on potable water supplies. James Shaw says it wasn't a positive report.
Look, I have to tell you, it's not great reading in the sense that there are 43 priority risks, of which 10 are very high priority, both in terms of severity and urgency that we need to deal with it.
He says not a lot has happened over the last decade, and that has its consequences.
There are probably some decisions that it would have been good if we had taken earlier in terms of the actual response on the ground. And as we know, the longer you leave something, the more expensive it gets to deal with.
But opposition climate change spokesperson Scott Simpson says it's unfair to suggest the last National government did nothing, given it signed New Zealand up to the Paris Agreement.
I don't think it's fair to characterise the National Party as some kind of laggards in this regard. But James Shaw is correct in that over the years, collectively, probably council, central government and us as individual citizens may not have done enough.
Both Mr Shaw and Mr Simpson agree that there's lessons for businesses, farmers, iwi and local councils. And today's report hits home in a very real and simple way what impact climate change is having on everyday life.
From my own area in the Coromandel, we went from quite a severe drought, in fact a very severe drought this year, to floods in literally 48 hours or so. And those are big extremes, and that kind of weather behaviour occurs in other parts of the country as well. And so for the farmers and the communities affected by that, it's real, it's very real.
There are dozens of examples in recent years of disasters caused or inflamed by climate change that have been left for civil defence to deal with. And Mr Shaw says it's time mitigation became the focus. He says if government had the data available now in years gone by, the country would be much further ahead in its flood defences.
Civil defence is kind of the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and it's always more expensive to deal with that when you're dealing with communities that are neck deep in water, or, if you've seen, for example, the fires in the Port Hills or around Nelson over the last few years.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has previously described climate change as this generation's nuclear-free moment, and she says today's report won't come as a surprise to people.
The question for us is, of course, making sure that we're continuing to invest in both mitigation, which we have, but also adaptation, as we see the full risk assessment that demonstrates there's some areas where we actually just need to prepare ourselves, whilst at the same time not accepting the inevitability of sea level rises while we have the ability to make a difference.
While Local Government New Zealand has welcomed today's report, it says unless it comes with the ability for councils to act on recommendations, then communities will be left vulnerable to the increasing number of severe weather events. The body, which represents the country's 78 local councils, says there's currently a massive central government legislative hole in the area of climate change adaptation. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jo Moyer.
2 NASA astronauts have returned to Earth in a dramatic retro-style splashdown, their capsule parachuting into the Gulf of Mexico to end an unprecedented test flight by Elon Musk's SpaceX company. It was the first splashdown by US astronauts in 45 years, on board the first commercially built and operated spacecraft to carry people to and from orbit. Chris Dignam from Reuters has more.
Splashdown.
A capsule carrying U.S. astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley splashed down in the Gulf of Mexico on Sunday after a 2-month voyage, NASA's first crewed mission from home soil in 9 years. The successful splashdown was also a final key test for Elon Musk's SpaceX and its new Crew Dragon spacecraft on whether it could transport astronauts to and from orbit, a feat no private company has accomplished before.
Dragon Endeavour has returned home. NASA astronauts Bob and Doug.
On behalf of the SpaceX and NASA teams, welcome back to planet Earth, and thanks for flying SpaceX.
Behnken and Hurley undocked from the International Space Station on Saturday and returned home to land in the waves off Florida's Pensacola coast on schedule. Their homecoming was the first crewed splashdown in an American capsule in 45 years. The landmark mission was launched from NASA's Kennedy Space Center on May 31st. On Sunday, President Donald Trump on Twitter said, quote, "Great to have NASA astronauts return to Earth after very successful 2-month mission. Thank you to all."
Let's return now to the Australian state of Victoria, where Premier Daniel Andrews is holding a press conference to announce more details on Level 4 lockdown restrictions. If you're just joining us, there were 429 new infections overnight and 13 deaths. It follows over 1,000 new infections and 20 deaths over the weekend. Metropolitan Melbourne is now under curfew from 8 p.m. until 5 a.m, with people only allowed to leave their homes for 1 hour's exercise within 5 kilometres of their homes every day. In the past half hour, Daniel Andrews has just announced 3 tiers of sector restrictions. Supermarkets, bottle shops, pharmacies, news agencies, post offices, butchers and bakeries will all remain open during the Level 4 lockdown. And we'll bring you all the details about that lockdown after the news at 6 o'clock.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Lei a tāua tēnei. Auckland Airport is splitting its international terminal into 2 so people can safely travel to and from bubble countries while others continue to return home from COVID-hit countries. The Chief Executive, Adrian Littlewood, says planning is well advanced so the airport is ready to go if and when the government announces bubble countries with reciprocal travel arrangements. Mr Littlewood told Checkpoint that for bubble travellers the airport will be close to normal.
Obviously, there are processes and protocols we have around hygiene and cleanliness and processes that we have in place that will persist, but it will be as close to normal for that destination. There will be shops and other services open at that time.
Adrian Littlewood says the airport undertaking work is not necessarily indicative of an upcoming government announcement. Many businesses across Victoria will be forced to shut down from Wednesday night as lockdown restrictions are tightened over the next 6 weeks. Another 429 coronavirus cases have been confirmed across the state in the past 24 hours, along with a further 13 deaths. The Premier, Daniel Andrews, says supermarkets, grocery stores and a range of other services will be permitted to remain open, but he says retailers and other businesses will need to close at midnight on Wednesday.
As heartbreaking as it is to close down places of employment, and whilst I never thought that I would be telling people not to go to work, that is what we have to do in order to stop the spread of this wildly infectious virus, this deadly virus.
Victoria's Premier Daniel Andrews. A petition that seeks to let backpackers stay in New Zealand over summer has attracted almost 13,500 signatures. The petition's urging the government to give a 6-month extension to working holiday visa holders. The organiser, Marie Bogg, who's on a working holiday from her home in Germany, says there are a number of reasons why many want to stay in New Zealand.
They are afraid of the situation back home. Maybe not only COVID, but in general, political situations aren't as good as in New Zealand. People are afraid of the future, and I think it's just very normal that you want to stay in a safe place as long as possible.
A spokesperson for the Immigration Minister, Chris Farfoy, says his office will look into whether there are plans to extend the visas, but says employers are encouraged to prioritise New Zealanders who have lost jobs as a result of COVID-19. The National Party would connect Ōtaki to Wellington's electric commuter train network and fast-track a 4-lane expressway from Ōtaki to Levin, if elected. National is promising to spend $330 million from its multi-billion-dollar infrastructure plan on projects for Horowhenua and the Kapiti Coast. These include electrifying and double-tracking the rail line to Ōtaki, building an expressway interchange in Pekapeka and completing the Horowhenua Expressway. National's transport spokesperson Chris Bishop says the projects would help support major population growth.
What you're seeing in this part of the world is Wellingtonians moving further north, moving up to Ōtaki, moving up to Levin, moving up to Waikanae, driven in part by the expressway and of course the slightly better climate up here compared to Wellington and the beaches of course, and you're seeing quite strong population growth.
Chris Bishop, the National Party transport spokesperson. There are concerns whether a complaints body being set up by Fire and Emergency will be independent from the organisation. Current and former firefighters say their previous complaints were squashed by superiors. Harry Locke reports.
The widespread culture of bullying and harassment at Fire and Emergency was laid bare in a report last year, which also found it's difficult for victims to lodge a complaint. The organisation's chief executive says a new authority to handle complaints is in the works, similar to the Independent Police Conduct Authority. However, a victim rights advocate and firefighters are questioning the independence of the new authority, as it will be a contracted body, and unlike the police watchdog, it won't be chaired by a judge. Ko Harry Lock, DNA.
A union says a private health company has ridden roughshod over staff and the community it's supposed to look after. The Public Service Association is mad that Healthcare NZ, which provides services for the elderly and disabled people, axed more than 100 regional jobs and replaced them with national call centres. It says Healthcare NZ clients report waiting for an hour or more when they attempt to call the new service centres. One was left trapped in bed without medication or a meal, waiting on hold for hours as they tried to get help. The association is calling for urgent action, asking the Ministry of Health to investigate. A family doctor who had a personal relationship with a patient has been ordered to apologise to the patient's wife. The Health and Disability Commissioner says the doctor also breached patient confidentiality, failing on professional and ethical standards. Rachel Thomas reports.
The Health and Disability Commissioner says a doctor should have known a personal relationship could affect the care of the man's wife and 3 children, who were all her patients. The pair bonded on Facebook, and the man eventually told his wife he was having an affair and was leaving her. When his distraught wife booked an appointment for a medical certificate, the doctor panicked and told the man about it, breaching the wife's privacy. The Commissioner ordered a year of mentoring for the doctor. This is Rachel Thomas.
It's coming up to 6 minutes past 6. Andy Hayden told the Crusaders coach Scott Razor-Robertson that his dying wish was for the Blues to beat the Crusaders at Eden Park in a fortnight. The two teams have been the inform franchises in Super Rugby Aotearoa. At Hayden's funeral today at Eden Park, the former All Black coach John Hart told the mourners that when Scott Robertson visited Andy Hayden in hospital in the days before he died, he was told his dying wish was for the Blues to win.
To which Razor smiled and said, "Andy, that sounds like match fixing to me." To which Andy smiled back and said, "I'm prepared to take the heat on that one, don't you worry about it."
John Hart speaking at the funeral of former All Black great Andy Hayden. There's not a lot at stake for the bottom 2 teams when they meet in Netball's ANZ Premiership tonight. The Waikato Bay of Plenty Magic host the Southern Steel in Hamilton. Either side will probably need to win all of their remaining 4 games to avoid playing in the wooden spoon game at the end of the season. And the former All Blacks wing Julian Savea is keen on playing for the Hurricanes next year. Back in New Zealand from a stint playing in France, the 29-year-old has rejoined his old team as a late season replacement for Super Rugby Aotearoa. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, if androids do dream of electric sheep, do we have a moral obligation not to abuse them? Canterbury University technology specialist Christoph Bartnek has been wondering. Nick Bollinger marks the 40th anniversary of Split Ends' True Colours with a special sampler summit, and sportscaster Zoe George on the line from somewhere in Aotearoa. But she was going to be in Japan at the Olympics. It's all on Nights of me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Coromandel, Gisborne and Northern Hawke's Bay. Mostly cloudy with a few showers clearing from most places tomorrow. For the remainder of the North Island, mainly fine apart from areas of cloud. A few showers possible about Auckland, Waikato and Western Bay of Plenty tonight. Nelson, Marlborough and Canterbury fine with areas of high cloud. Bulla, areas of cloud in the north but periods of rain in the south. Westland and Fiordland cloudy, periods of rain in Westland spreading to some parts of Fiordland tomorrow. Otago and Southland fine with increasing high cloud, rain developing about coastal Southland tomorrow night. And Chatham Islands cloudy periods, a few showers tomorrow. RNZ National, it's 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks so much, Susanna. Welcome back to Checkpoint. The Victorian Premier has announced 13 more people have died from COVID-19 in the last 24 hours, bringing the state's death toll to 136. There are 429 new cases today, bringing the total active cases to 6,489. Daniel Andrews has just told media new regulations on businesses will come into effect this Wednesday night as part of the state's ongoing lockdown and curfew.
As heartbreaking as it is, to close down places of employment. And whilst I never thought that I would be telling people not to go to work, that is what we have to do in order to stop the spread of this wildly infectious virus, this deadly virus.
He said there are different categories of businesses, each with their own rules. Supermarkets, grocery stores, petrol stations, post offices, banks and those directly responding to the pandemic will be considered essential and will remain open. The Premier warned against panic buying.
The people do not need to be going and buying 6 weeks' worth of groceries. I understand that there is a sense of concern in the community, and hopefully the clarity of the message today, you do not need to do that, because supermarkets, as well as grocery stores, the local fruit and veg, the local butcher, the baker, all of those shops, they will remain open.
He said other businesses such as restaurants, cafes and gyms will be closed. Large-scale construction would be further reduced, and while smaller-scale building sites can keep operating, only 5 people will be permitted on site at any one time. Retail and some manufacturing will also close, with the Premier saying it will look very different.
For instance, Bunnings will be, you will no longer be able to go into a Bunnings store, but you will be able to collect goods without making contact with anybody. So some of those drive-through arrangements.
The Victorian Premier Dan Andrews says there will be support for businesses, including a further $5,000 grant and other types of financial assistance. The overall package is in the order of $600 million Australian dollars. Well, Sandy Chong is the CEO of the Australian Hairdressing Council and says hairdressers in Victoria have been waiting for some direction about what the renewed lockdown will mean for them. Under today's announcement, they'll be forced to close. Sandy Chong joins me now live. Good evening, Sandy. Can you tell me what your reaction is to this announcement today from Premier Andrews?
Look, I think that the majority of the industry will be really pleased, I think, to finally get a government directive as to whether they're open or closed. I think that we are very concerned about the mental health of many of our businesses, as well as being exposed to corona as well. We're worried about the mental health of the business owners and also their staff. And with many of these businesses, they've been really concerned about losing clients, losing staff and losing their businesses. So on one hand, it's really sad, and I know that you've been through it before, to see that our hairdressing salons will close from Wednesday night at midnight, so Thursday. On the other hand, it's at least finally given them a directive, a definite directive as to what is happening over the next 6 weeks. From a small business perspective, though, a couple of things. We do need to seek more clarification on sole traders, because there's a little bit of sort of grey area there as to whether sole traders can also operate. And then the other thing, too, is just what kind of other, help being in business will our small businesses get, in particular when it comes to the commercial leasing scheme or when it comes to payroll tax. And also, too, with the grant, it's great that they're being given $10,000 all up, and regional areas $5,000, but it's how quickly will they get that, because cash flow is really going to be a concern right now.
Absolutely. Just to head back to the sole traders point that you've made there, Sandy, is there a possibility that they could be exempt and people could still get their hair done if it's a one-on-one situation?
Well, it's interesting because the documentation that I've been sent through, it doesn't specifically say hairdressers, it just says exempt will be sole traders. And it is much easier to control your area, your space, when it comes to work health and safety or your COVID procedures when it's just one-on-one. And we've always said all along that that is much easier to control compared to a business where you've got 5 or 6 staff and you've got, members of the public walking in and out. So we are seeking more clarification on that. It is a bit of a grey area, but that is a possibility right now, looking at the paperwork that I've just seen. But it's not, 100% confirmed, so that's something that I need to get back to ASAP.
What are small business owners telling you overall about how they're likely to fare during this lockdown, especially with the support that's being offered? Well, I think that for any small business owner, and I'm a small business owner as well, then there is the fear of losing your business. There are some businesses that will not get through this 6 weeks for sure. And so
I think also to losing staff, not every business were able to get JobKeeper. So, those payments were $1,500 a fortnight coming from the government. And so if you were eligible, then you got JobKeeper. But there were some employees who are not eligible for JobKeeper, including the visa workers. If you're from New Zealand, you are. But if you're from overseas, then you're not eligible for JobKeeper. And therefore, there's a possibility that you're going to lose your staff, a high possibility of that. And Melbourne has a lot of visa workers too, by the way. So employment, not being able to pay your bills, your invoices, pay your rent, they're all small business concerns at the moment, just getting through this next 6 weeks.
Is there an overall feeling, though, Sandy, that today's restrictions and ramp up, it was necessary?
Absolutely. I think that, we look at this second wave and it's so much worse than our first wave. And unfortunately, there's been so many, people who are just not taking this seriously, that are out and about. And they've made it very clear that, the COVID has spread because there are those who have had their tests and while they're waiting for the results, they've been out and about. And so many have just not taken it seriously. So it's now time to clamp down and just try and get control of this. So unfortunately, we've gone into the stage 4. It could have been avoided if everybody did the right thing. But, at the end of the day, in my position, I think that the safety of our businesses, of our business owners, our staff and our communities is number one. And even though I know a lot of business will suffer, we have to think about our families and we have to think about each other's health. That has to come first. So, I think that it's necessary at this point to be stage 4, but thank God it's not regional Victoria. It is just the city in the metro and Mitchell.
Hey, Sandy, thank you so much for your time and best of luck. That was Sandy Chong, the CEO of the Australian Hairdressing Council. Meanwhile, New Zealanders in Melbourne are struggling as the light at the end of the tunnel gets pushed further away with a tighter COVID-19 lockdown. For many people, it's another extension to the lockdown they've been in for months. Charlotte Cook reports.
Sweeping new restrictions, including a nighttime curfew, are in force in Melbourne. For some New Zealanders living there, they've been holed up at home since March. Some are anxious to find out if they can keep their jobs, and others are dreaming of New Zealand. Kiwi Brett McCulloch works as a builder in Melbourne and says people are struggling with the uncertainty.
I think today's probably the toughest day, I reckon. Just waiting for, if the industry is going to shut or close, shut down, or they can stay open. I think today will be the worst day. But no, I think they will. I think they'll just shut everything. Just do what New Zealand done. Get it done, shut it down, and then hopefully move on in 4 or 6 weeks.
Joseph Nunweek says everyone in the city is feeling pretty glum to be facing further lockdowns. He says the government should have ripped the Band-Aid off months ago.
It was spun yesterday afternoon from the press conference as being we can do this now until September the 13th, or we can do less restrictions but still a lot of being by yourself and being alone until Christmas or New Year's. And I think that may be what people understand in terms of really committing to it at this stage.
Teacher Jeff Dean lives in one of Melbourne's COVID hotspots and has been working from home since March. He says not only has it taken a toll on his mental health, but it's frightening that people still aren't following the rules.
The arrogance that some people had that it's not going to affect them, it's been incredibly scary. I've been nervous every time I go out of the house, to go and get your shopping or... As I said, it's a scary place to live at the moment.
He says with no real end date, it's quite daunting.
There's always a light at the end of the tunnel, but, they don't know how long the tunnel is. And that's not knowing when it's going to end because they keep adding weeks on. As I said, the original lockdown was meant to finish, and then they brought in another one and did the whole of metropolitan Melbourne. That goes till the middle of August. And then now they've said, well, we're here till mid-September. So the goalposts keep moving, the tunnel keeps getting longer.
Hannah Finlay has been doing the lockdown hard yards for months and says it's frustrating to see the numbers keep climbing.
With the announcement that happened through yesterday, I think it was just like a big sigh of shit. And especially when we're in Victoria, we can see all the other states hanging out and, living almost normally. It's just real frustrating. I feel like we're like that naughty kid in school that has been held in detention and lunch and we can see all our friends playing and we're not allowed to go outside.
Sophie Kemp says it would be nice to come home, but it's not an easily achievable possibility.
I've got a flexi fare ticket home, just kind of hovering.
but having to pay for your own quarantine unless you're coming home for more than 90 days, that's pretty much a roadblock for me. I don't think I could afford to pay rent in Melbourne and pay for my, the mandatory quarantine on the other side of that and lose a month of my life just sitting in a hotel on my own.
For most, New Zealand seems much further away than before as they stare down the barrel of at least 6 more weeks in lockdown. For Checkpoint, Charlotte Cook.
It has just gone 19 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The Prime Minister has shot down any hopes for an imminent travel bubble, despite Auckland Airport announcing its preparations for just that. The airport plans to split its terminal into 2 zones to prevent mixing and mingling between travellers from different flights, a major concern for any bubble. The prospect of a trans-Tasman bubble has been bandied about for some time, with New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters calling for one more than a month ago. But a disastrous setback in the Australian state of Victoria has seen a huge surge of infections there, and with it, tough restrictions on movements. Jacinda Ardern told reporters that will clearly slow down progress towards any trans-Tasman travel.
I haven't put a time frame on it, but everyone can see, based on our clear criteria right from the beginning, that we will not open a trans-Tasman bubble until it is safe. It will be obvious to everyone that that is not right now, and it will not be for some time to come.
So with Australia off the table for now, focus has shifted to what's been dubbed a Pacific Air Corridor. It would restart travel with the Cook Islands and Niue, both of which are recording no cases of COVID-19. But Ms Ardern is not sounding particularly keen on that either, even with Auckland Airport's preparations.
Our borders, and I include very much the physical space of airports, are places where people with COVID are moving and interacting and engaging. So they are very high-risk environments. We need to be absolutely assured when we're looking at any Pacific bubble with the likes of the Cook Islands that there is no contact between both people who may have come from high-risk areas, but also making sure even that we're not engaging with the same surfaces. That's the level of rigour that we need. It's not the only thing. We have to have in place a legal arrangement, protocols for pre-checks for arrival and departure, health declarations and whether they're taken from health or airlines, and whether or not you'd have things like testing or temperature checks as extra layers. We have to move through this very, very carefully.
That was Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Storms, heat waves, extreme rainfall and drought, along with more coastal erosion and risk of wildfires. The first National Climate Change Risk Assessment out today paints a grim picture of the long list of risks New Zealand faces as a result of climate change. It's the first time all the risks have been in one place and shows how communities, ecosystems and businesses will be affected. Minister for Climate Change James Shaw says the report provides a very specific snapshot, which in some ways, he says, is a comfort.
We have known for many years that New Zealand faces increasing risks from things like floods and fires and droughts and storms due to climate change, but we've never had any specificity around that. So in some ways, I actually feel a sense of relief when I look through this report because forewarned is forearmed, and because this does have a lot of scientific rigour to it, and it does kind of paint the whole picture, it does mean that we're actually able to respond in a way that we haven't been able to before, because previously we've really just been responding to the symptoms, if you like, and now we can actually take a much more systemic approach. It does make for some pretty grim reading in parts, though. What do we do now that we have this information? Well, what's already happening is that the government is developing a national adaptation and response. That's a legal requirement under the Zero Carbon Act. So the idea is that the Climate Change Commission will update this risk assessment every 6 years, and the government is legally required to respond with an updated adaptation plan. And as that plan develops, what it means is that Treasury, for example, will be able to start factoring in the costs of adaptation into its long-term fiscal forecasts. Different government agencies that have got, greater levels of responsibility for certain elements of this, such as, say, Department of Internal Affairs, which looks after local government, will be able to start factoring in how we respond to these risks in terms of their plans and their own budget bids in the future and so on. So it is going to create it is going to stimulate a response right across government, and I think that is the good news. It feels like we've been playing whack-a-mole up until this point, and now we can actually approach it with some a kind of comprehensive view.
10 of these risks require urgent attention. How does that wait for 2 years? What are we doing now about that?
Well, I mean, the good news is that we have actually already started work on at least some of these things, and it does mean that the next government, obviously of which we hope to be a part, kind of has its marching orders in terms of saying, look, you've got to get to work on things like coastal ecosystems, indigenous ecosystems, social cohesion, those kinds of things. And we do have some work that various bits of government have already been working on that we can build on. So we certainly won't be waiting until the publication of that first adaptation plan. But when that adaptation plan does come out, I think you'll see yet another step change in the government response at that point.
The report talks about preparation for high-end scenarios, kind of worst-case scenarios. Is that how we're tracking at the moment? Should we be bracing for the worst possible scenarios in New Zealand?
Yeah, so the whole idea behind this is that you do kind of need to plan for the worst when it comes to the effects of climate change, because if you don't, then you leave yourself exposed to greater levels of risk. And of course, if you look around the world at the moment, given the current level of international action to reducing emissions, the high-end scenarios actually have a pretty good chance of turning out, which is not good news. And so therefore, the least regrets approach is to plan for the worst. Of course, because these plans get updated every 6 years, by the time we get to the next one, things may well have changed, and then we could lower the risk profile.
Is that true of New Zealand, though? Are you expecting it would go lower, or looking at the situation we face here now, would you expect that to be on track?
I certainly think, based on what we currently know, that it is entirely prudent and sensible for us to plan for the worst outcome.
The importance of Matauranga Maori is highlighted quite a few times throughout this report. When that plan comes back in a couple of years, do you expect that to factor in quite a bit?
Yes, I do. And the job that government has got is to make sure that we really actively engage with iwi and Māori organisations right up and down the country to make absolutely sure that, A, they're as fully informed and have access to all the right information, and that they're in a position to be able to make choices and decisions about their own future and have the resources to be able to do so.
Will you be Climate Change Minister to see those plans and adaptations through?
Well, I hope so.
To the US now, where a top White House medical expert has warned COVID-19 infections are surging in rural America. The ABC's Barbara Miller reports.
Dr. Deborah Birx has been on the move herself, visiting 14 states to assess firsthand the spread of and response to coronavirus. She's concerned about what she observed.
I can tell you across America right now, people are on the move. And so all of our discussions about social distancing and decreasing gatherings to under 10, as I traveled around the country, I saw all of America moving.
The White House advisor told CNN the pandemic has entered a new phase in the US, spreading deep into rural communities.
I want to be very clear. What we're seeing today is different from March and April. It is extraordinarily widespread. It's into the rural as equal urban areas. And to everybody who lives in a rural area, you are not immune or protected from this virus.
Dr. Carlos Del Rio from Emory University School of Medicine in Atlanta says that's a worry.
I'm very concerned. In many of the rural counties, in many of the rural communities, we don't have hospitals, we don't have necessary ICUs, and we certainly don't have infectious disease physicians. And I'm very concerned that we're going to have a serious problem in those areas.
Lawmakers in the US are struggling to agree on a new aid package for those affected by the virus. And there are many of them. More than 4.5 million Americans have tested positive. 155,000 have died. In the UK, new cases of COVID-19 are still in the hundreds per day. 744 in the latest 24 hours. But the government has hosed close down suggestions the over 50s may soon be told to stay at home and isolate. Frontbencher Robert Jenrick.
There's no plans for that at the moment.
The question of whether or not schools in the UK can reopen after the summer holidays in September is being hotly debated. A top scientific advisor came up with what for many Brits is an alarming suggestion that if schools opened, there would have to be a trade-off, and pubs, he said, should then be closed again to keep a lid on transmission. But Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick said schools would open as planned.
I believe that schools are safe, will be safe in September. We have to get children back to school. It's so important for the future of our children and for the whole country that they have face-to-face contact.
And that was Housing Secretary Robert Jenrick, ending that report by the ABC's Barbara Miller. Just before we go, time for some feedback tonight on people wanting visa extensions. This person's got in touch to say sailors and backpackers not wanting to go home is what will happen if allowing foreign students back isn't well managed too. Another regarding overseas people in New Zealand who want to leave, let them stay. We're not good at a lot of things, but we do compassion, kindness, empathy and fairness well. I'll help towards costs. And Lorraine has got in touch to say, seems sensible when farmers, etc. need seasonal workers. On the travel bubble, forget Australia. Why aren't we setting up a travel bubble with Taiwan? They have 23 million travel-loving people and less active cases than we do. I would like a bubble with Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau, says another. That's all we have time for this evening. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for joining us on Checkpoint.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Auckland Airport is splitting its international terminal into two so people can safely travel to and from bubble countries at the same time as others return home from COVID-hit countries. In Australia, many businesses across Victoria will be forced to shut down from Wednesday night as part of a strict COVID lockdown. The National Party has announced major roading projects for the Lower North Island if it's elected, including connecting Otaki to Wellington's electric commuter train network. And the National Gymnastics body has vowed to double its educational efforts following a raft of abuse allegations at an Auckland club. Those are the headlines. Our next news is at 7.
Take the pulse of the day's news every weeknight at 10.
The quality of the housing can be quite difficult to raise in North Dunedin.
Live with local, national and international stories and a slice of creativity.
Barefoot if we're on stage, sandals if I need to keep my socks dry.